you begin to realize that value touches absolutely every single thing that we do. And it was through pondering this that I came to the conclusion that value at the end of the day is feeling, how an individual feels about something. But then, of course, we have to make decisions as a group. And so it becomes, how does the group feel about something? How confident or not confident the group is? Or how does the market feel about something? Hi, I'm Andrew Davis.
And I'm Steve Pereira.
And this
is the Value Stream Show. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Value Stream Show session. This time we're going to be talking about value, because before we sort of head off in different directions, I think it's really valuable to start talking about targets, right? Destinations. And when I think about destinations, I think about value, the thing that we're pursuing that can move us in a bunch of different directions. So let me ask you, Andrew, before we kick this off, what do you think about when you think about value?
What is value? It's an interesting thing, right? Because on one hand, we've got our society. Everybody in our society, more or less, is literate about the basics of economics and money and buying and selling and these kinds of things. And so value is very easy to give it a very concrete meaning about the price of something. The price, we assume that the price of something is related to the value. And if you have a little bit more sophistication, you think, well, no, the value that a person gets should always be higher than the price. And that's theoretically, if I think that this food is worth $10 and it only costs $5, or $10 of value, but it only costs $5, then I'll buy the food and it's a great deal for me. That's the general theory of economics, right? Is that everybody gets a good deal, right? You get these. If you dig a bit more at value, on the level of value, you think, actually, this is a really, really, really deep subject, because it deals with why do we, for example, my wife and I work, she doesn't. I fund all of our lives together. She's not contributing anything economically specifically, but clearly it's in my best interest to be with her and financing our lives and so forth. Why? Well, clearly I receive value from that. And what's the value that I receive, right? That's things like companionship and, conversation and, helping to do the activities of daily living. And you begin to realize that if, back to that food analogy, if I get $10 of value from that, but I only pay $5, well, what is value then? The actual value that I'm experiencing is, well, it alleviates my hunger, makes me feel good. Maybe there's a good conversation at that restaurant. And you begin to realize that value touches absolutely every single thing that we do. And it was through pondering this that I'd love to debate this with you, but I came to the conclusion that value at the end of the day is feeling, how an individual feels about something. But then, of course, we have to make decisions as a group. And so it becomes, how does the group feel about something? How confident or not confident the group is? Or how does the market feel about something? And so you have the stock market, for example, which theoretically shows you the valuation of these major companies. And all of a sudden now, this is summer of 2022, we've just watched all of the tech sector tank in terms of their market valuation. So, and they say things as headlines like, $1 trillion of value has been wiped out from the economy. How? Where did it go? Where did it go? Where did all the value go? Well, if you realize that it is feeling, and which means it is absolutely as fickle as feeling. And so if all of a sudden all of these hedge funds and traders and so forth get spooked, and this wave of panic spreads across these traders, like a wave of panic spreading across a herd of wildebeests, then all of a sudden they're full of fear, right? And you realize these words, fear and greed, right? The two words that are used to define a lot of the market movements. So these people full of fear, and all of a sudden the future doesn't look so bright. They don't feel nearly as optimistic as they once did. And all of a sudden that $1 trillion of value gets wiped away. And I think put numbers to it, it gives us some reassurance. It makes us feel like this stuff is real, as real as a problem or a math problem. And this is the long history of economics kind of coming out of Newtonian physics and European society and so forth, this belief that we're dealing with something real here, and that we should be able to measure these things, and that there's an actual value to these things, we realize that that's only under certain special cases can you attribute like a numeric value to things and talk about it as if it has a degree of reality. Otherwise, it's just all about feeling individually and collectively. What do you think?
I think that's a fantastic summary, whirlwind tour of something that's extremely complex and complicated. And I completely agree with you, that this idea of sentiment driving value and the intangibility of it, right? I mean, it's something that you truly just have a sense of value that can be influenced by many different factors. And I think that, what's really complicated about this and why people struggle is that it applies to the macro, like you were saying, at the market level, and which is, global and all encompassing. And then at the micro level, it's sort of like, well, what do I want to eat for lunch? Like what's valuable to me in this moment? What is going to satisfy me, or what is going to make me happy or make me feel fulfilled? And a lot of that can be subconscious. I mean, even the market, it has a degree of sort of subconscious where it doesn't necessarily know what it's doing. It just sort of reacts and moves in different just directions. And I think, your categorization of like fear and greed being these macro forces is really valuable to frame this, because that also, I think, is a fractal representation of something that can occur at a micro level, right? I mean, we are motivated individually by fear and greed. It's like pursuit of value in the greed sense of like, I think I should move in this direction. I want to capture this opportunity or capitalize on this. I want to avoid risk. I want to avoid negative outcomes. And we know a lot about how those sort of motivations drive our behaviors. And I think that in a value stream management context or a value stream context in the domain that we live in, we're occupying a space that really encompasses a large degree of that territory, right? We not necessarily driving markets, but entire organizations are influenced by value streams and the network of value streams that kind of compose the organization, all the activity that's driving outcomes. And that's all made up of individual contributors, right? At the end of the day, you have individual contributors who are working and moving in specific directions. One thing that's helped me define value in a business context, and I think that a lot of folks, will be well served for the purposes of clarity if they're focusing on, business value is kind of like this subset that helps us constrain our understanding of value in a possibly productive ways, but an understanding that there's organizational value, there's customer value, and there's individual value, and understanding that all those things hopefully align or converge in useful ways. You don't want individual value, so value to an individual contributor being in a completely different direction than the organization or to customers, which means that they're just walking away with their laptop and going to a pawn shop, or building something that looks good on their resume but doesn't necessarily deliver on the customer's desired outcome or the organization's desired outcome. And likewise, at the other end of the spectrum, you don't want customers kind of pulling the organization in a direction that's counter to their mission, or the organization kind of moving in a direction that their customers wouldn't be happy with. And all these things sort of have to work in harmony together.
So we've been talking about enabling development teams to have greater impact on their business. So I want to pause briefly to talk about the next generation of development teams and to thank our sponsor, Copado. Copado's focus is on bringing the power of DevOps to low-code platforms such as Salesforce, ServiceNow, and SAP. The world of development is changing fast, And a lot of the IT innovation happening in our organizations now is being done on these low-code platforms and being done by people who may not have a traditional software development background. So the challenge is that these systems are becoming incredibly complex. So low-code development may be easy to begin with and easier to get started with, but when you're dealing with dozens or even hundreds of contributors working over the course of months and years, you pretty quickly reach a scale where you need things like version control, automated deployments, automated testing, and value stream management. So that's where Copado helps as the leading DevOps and testing platform for low-code. So if you're managing a platform like Salesforce, ServiceNow, or SAP, check them out at copado.com, get a demo, and find tons of other resources. Now back to our show. So we talk about macroeconomics, market movements on the massive side, micro on the feelings of an individual. I totally agree with you. The theme of this podcast, in case you're wondering what it is we're talking about or going to talk about, is kind of nestled right in the middle at that sweet spot of value streams, which are the work processes that are nestled in between these three forces: the customer value, the organizational value, the individual contributor value. And these three things are fighting. Reminds me of a traditional Buddhist analogy that all of the elements inside the body are like a basket of snakes, and they're wrestling and fighting with each other constantly. And at one point, one of them overpowers the other ones and eats them all up, and then they all die. And that's how the body ends up dying. The elements become imbalanced. So there's this. It's a wrestling and a fighting, right? These things are in tension. And everybody in business, on one level or another, knows that these things are in tension. Are we going to give too much to the customer and not charge enough? Is the customer going to take advantage of us? Are we going to not build what the customer needs? And are we going to become irrelevant? Are we going to lose the customers? And so there's this delicate, dependent relationship between the business and the customer. And then there's this delicate interrelationship between the business and the individual contributors, the organization and the individual contributors. The management typically most organizational leaders veer between externally induced crises and internally induced crises, trying to keep their staff happy and harmonious and effective and so forth, and trying to keep the customers satisfied. And I'm sure maybe we're using these somewhat academic words to describe this, but if you're in a business context, you know what we're talking about. If you check your feelings, if you check your experience, we're all nestled in between these three. I loved your two extreme examples of taking your laptop to the pawn shop, which at first I thought that was a little bit of an extreme example. your company issued laptop, just selling it for cash. At first I thought it was an extreme example, but no, it's not really, especially in this world of remote work. You hire somebody, you have no idea. You've never seen them face to face. Yeah, we mailed this person a $2,000 computer. Are we ever going to see them again? So there's a degree of trust. But I think this resume-driven development is one very common failure mode for individuals. And I think there is this, I think you and I are both here because we believe that there is a phenomenal amount of efficiency that can be reclaimed from these processes. Because on one level, if your employees are not feeling profoundly engaged with the mission of the company to serve the customers for the greater good of the organization, whatever degree less than 100% of engagement employees have, one way or another, their own sense of intrinsic value, is it worth it for me to be here? How much energy should I put in? How much should I care? How many shits should I give, so to speak, if you want to be able to measure it, put some metrics on it, then there will, consciously or unconsciously, from each individual employee, they'll be, slow walking things. They'll be dragging their feet. They won't be contributing their best ideas. They won't necessarily be motivated to work harmoniously with others and so forth. And so one way or another, as organizations or whatever team you're functioning in, either you nail this value stream stuff or you're functioning suboptimally. And when I say nail it, of course, there's no arriving, there's no final state, but early on in the journey, there's typically big wins you can reclaim quickly.
Yeah, and I think that those The low-hanging fruit, those easy wins, are due to this misalignment, this kind of foundational misalignment between understandings of value. We move in different directions, and we have different time horizons for our understanding of value also. Like my understanding of what's valuable immediately is usually to the detriment of what's valuable to me in the long term. And so there's that tension as well, the tension of time and the tension of visibility. Like if I can only see 2 feet in front of my face, and if I can look off into the horizon or see into the future. And so that's an interesting dimension for us to consider in the context of value stream management. Somewhere in that big picture is beyond our level of individual visibility, but there's also, I think, the promise of something like value stream management. Data and understanding history allows us to define value and focus our efforts in such a way that we will be serving. But that might be all, we might be floating in the stratosphere with this. One of the things that I wanted to cover before we break on value that might be a little bit more tangible to folks is I find it's helpful to talk about what it's not. And I have a list kind of floating around in my head, but I might miss one. So I'd appreciate your perspective on this, Andrew. But the easiest way that I could communicate it was what it's not. I did this list of what's not valuable or what's not value based on personal experience in thinking that these things are value and being very directly corrected. And there are things like time, right? The amount of time that you spend on something is not a measurement of value, right? You could spend 2 seconds on something and derive incredible amounts of value from that. It's also not effort, right? The amount of effort that you put into something doesn't necessarily correlate with value in any way. And it's not cost. What you charge for something is not an indication of its value. And, it's very expensive. It can be perfect quality. It could be, the edges could be perfectly straight. It could look exactly the way you want it to look. Who wants a gold brick? It's worth nothing more than the value of the gold, essentially, right? No one cares that it's formulated into a brick. It's kind of useless in its form. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can have something like the one I always think of is a vuvuzela, because for a couple of reasons. Vuvuzela, if anybody remembers, kind of like the last World Cup, or maybe it was a couple back, where everybody had these plastic flutes that just made noise. And the whole purpose was just to be obnoxious. And they would cost, pennies to make. They cost dollars to buy. And they're essentially like of extremely low quality, right? I mean, they're used for nothing else other than this, one singular activity. And then they've all but vanished from the world because, their value is kind of like centered on this singular activity at this point in time where they became trendy and then sort of fell off the face of the planet. Everybody sort of agreed these are more obnoxious. Did I hit all the points there, Andrew? Is there anything value in the context of quality, time, effort, cost, all these things that tend to get wrapped up in value?
Yeah, and when you started talking, I there was some long list sort of out in the ether that we'd be reading from and imagining. But really, I think there's 2 components. There's the costs of the raw materials, the inputs, and things you mentioned, time and effort and raw materials and so forth, money and so money as cost, for example. Those are not the value of the final product. And so the implicit in what you said is that there is some transformation going on. There's a transformation of raw materials, whether that's time and effort, whatever other components, into something of value. And we should not confuse the value of the inputs with the value of whatever has been produced, I would say, because those things that you listed, they do have value, time and effort and raw materials and so forth. They all do have value. But the question is, have they produced a valuable output? And when we're talking about value streams, we're talking about a work process that is a group of people coming together to compose something that had not previously existed, that theoretically could have a value vastly greater than the raw input materials. Like you said, Vuvuzela, by the way, that's your word of the day. If you're listening, Vuvuzela, repeat that 100 times. Pennies to make, dollars to sell. So there was a dramatic increase in value because of the circumstances, because of the World Cup, and there's this social movement phenomenon of this crowd psychology arising that actually made the Vuvuzela worth dollars, right? That's actually very, very valuable, although it's short-lived. And so all of these things are impermanent, right? Because as you point out, the Vuvuzela is the value of it is it's impermanent, it's transient, it's volatile, if you want, because it was all dependent on this psychological mood at that time, that particular circumstances that created the mass psychological effect of a lot of people thinking, this is a great idea, I need one, it's easily worth $2 to buy. And sorry if I've taken us back into the stratosphere, right? But so the inputs that you mentioned, they do have value, but we shouldn't confuse the value of the inputs with the value of the output. And more broadly, though, the other things we could confuse the value of the output with would be the selling price. And that was where we started off. The selling price is not the value of the item, as one of the most obvious examples, or other people's opinion, collective opinion can't necessarily represent the value of something. If I show you my family heirlooms, old family photographs, for you, they have like a photo of my father when he was a child. For you, zero value. For me, enormous value, right? So value, because value is just feeling. This is my thesis statement until somebody disabuses me of it. It can be totally individual. It is as transient as our feelings and as stable as our feelings. And if you look at, I've had very stable, positive feelings towards burritos for most of my life, right? So, but of course, the value of that goes up and down depending on how hungry I am. But there is a degree of stability even to something as transient as feelings. And I guess I'll end my part by pointing people, if you haven't seen it, to the Bain elements of value. Bain Consulting did an awesome chart that I think our friend Saeed Khan certainly introduced me to, but the Bain elements of value, and they've got a B2C elements of value for consumers and B2B elements of value. And that, I think, is such a great illustration that broadens the aperture, broadens our scope of understanding what value is. It includes things like security and predictability and comfort and money and all these kinds of things.
I love that. I think that was the one thing that I wanted to mention before we wrapped. And so I'm glad you brought that up. So we'll link to that in the show notes. We'll also link to the Wikipedia page for the Vuvuzela in case anybody wants to dig into that. And
correction. I'm gonna link to an Amazon affiliate page for Vuvuzelas where we get paid if you buy Vuvuzelas on the Value Stream show.
Oh wow! Now we're getting into interesting territory. But yeah, with that, we will see you next time. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thanks for joining us. Please rate, review, and share the podcast. And make sure to visit us at valuestreamshow.com to sign up for our newsletter and find show notes, episodes, and more.